Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 14 of Epidemics of Injustice. I'm Washika Torres, the instructor, and we have Mr. Richard Wallace here, who will be giving his presentation in a moment, or he will be giving his talk in a moment. So please make sure you are looking at the chat to submit any information. And here we go. Sorry, for some reason, this is on the first page. Welcome to Epidemics of Injustice. This semester's theme is co-disruption for collective liberation in public health. So please introduce yourself in the chat with names and pronouns. Complete the check-in form, which is at the bit.ly, just link here, or scan the QR code. During the presentation, please put questions or comments in the chat. We will take one question. We will take one or two questions from the audience, and then we'll look at the other ones, but there will be time for questions at the end. For participation controls, you have mute in the lower left-hand corner, and if you want to have your video on, it's not required. It's right next to that one, to the right of that, and if you want to open the chat, it is between the record and share screen button, and you can type a question or comment in the group, and then if you want to close it, you just click chat again. The course instructors and teaching assistants are myself, Washika Torres, Nandini Sarap, and Katie O'Neill. This annual course is free and open to the public, prepares public health leaders and community members with the tools to bring about social change and address structural determinants of health. All courses will be taking place virtually, and this course is open to students and the public from 5:30 to 6:30 CST, and students taking the course for credit will stay from 6:30 to 7:30 for a closed discussion. Epidemics of Injustice is sponsored by the Collaboratory for Health Justice at the USC School of Public Health. And we would also like to thank the Radical Public Health for the creation, support, and promotion of this program. RPH is celebrating its 11th year. So for more information about RPH, please visit facebook.com/Radical Public Health. Warning, today's lecture contains material that might be difficult to discuss. Please step away if you need to take care of yourself during the presentation. The Collaboratory for Health Justice acknowledges that the University of Illinois at Chicago resides on the traditional territories of the three Fire peoples, the Ojibwe, the Ottawa, and the Potawatomi, purchased after 2.5 years of open warfare, decades of violent encroachment, and the defeat of a pan-Indian movement to keep settlers out of the Great Lake region at the Treaty of Chicago in 1821, receiving their final payment before moving westward in 1835. This area was also a site of trade, gathering, and healing for more than a dozen other Native tribes. The state of Illinois is currently home to more than 75,000 tribal members, and the Chicagoland area is currently home to one of the largest and most diverse urban Native communities in the U.S. Illinois is also the territory of the Ho-Chunk, Miami, Anoka, Menominee, Sac, Fox, and their descendants. By making a land acknowledgement, we recognize that Indigenous peoples are the traditional stewards of the land that we now occupy, living here before Chicago was a city and still thriving here today. As we work, live, play on these territories, we must ask what we can do to right the historic wrongs of colonialization and state violence and support Indigenous peoples, Indigenous community struggles for self-determination and sovereignty. So please show up on time and come prepared. Please let everyone participate, listen with an open mind, have mutual respect and appreciation for one another, and respect the privacy and personal information shared during class. So for the informal work portion of this, we will have Mr. Richard Wallace. Richard Wallace, him, is an artist, organizer, and founder of Equity and Transformation, also known as E. His work focuses on organizing Black informal workers to confront anti-Black racism in the U.S. and abroad. He is also the founder of Roosevelt University student chapter of the Stop Mass Incarceration Network, the founder of the Future of Benin program in West Africa, one of the inaugural AFRE fellows, Volcal alumni, Soros Justice alumni, and was recently selected as an inaugural Margaret Burroughs Fellow. So please welcome Mr. Richard Wallace. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Oh wow, it's just me on camera now. I feel a little bit awkward, but I'll make it work. Richard Wallace, his founder of Equity and Transformation, the son of Reverend Doris Green and Eugene Wallace, who hailed from Arkansas and Jackson, Mississippi. And ultimately from the coast of Benin, West Africa. And so I'm happy to be here, grateful to be on this call. I like to kind of lead with that because I think in reality, for me, those are the stories that brought me to this work. I think I come to this work with those histories at my back. And that also gives me a little bit of a confidence in the fact that I'm not alone in the search for answers, truth, and liberation. I am an organizer in the city of Chicago. I've been organizing in labor I organized in labor for a number of years. I also did some HIV prevention work in my early years, and I was an MC in a group called BBU. And I think all of those things, I like to start with, like to say that I'm an artist first who organizes. And it was through art that I was really able to, where I think that what they call the sociological imagination blossomed when I was able to think about the world that we lived in different ways and reimagine possibilities. And we would bring those possibilities alive through the art that we produced and the way that people looked at the art that we produced. So I'll get into, the talk, which is essentially, we founded an organization in 2018 called Equity and Transformation, also known as EAT. It was founded by post-incarcerated, formerly incarcerated people just like myself. I've had the unique experience of living two lifestyles in one lifetime. One of those lifestyles is, I think for a lot of the youth that came up the way I came up, they didn't make it to, a UIC talk. And so I take these moments extremely serious. And the reason was, I always try to flash back and think like what was different between me and some of my comrades that were in the streets. And it was that my mom had but she had a full-time job. She was working in the field of HIV and AIDS prevention. And she was able to bring me into the work as soon as I requested, right, that I was done with the streets. And the streets gave me a lot of knowledge because I existed on the streets for a number of years with no formal employment. And so when I got into, when I came back to Chicago, was, I lived in a shelter. These are all real life experiences, right? And while I was there, I started a rap group called BBU, and we ended up touring the world, right? And that wasn't a formal job either. I think my first real formal job was working in the field of HIV and AIDS prevention. And I was able to see the benefits of getting a full-time, the full-time salary and the benefits and, having insurance and not really knowing how to use it, which was really weird. It was like, I got insurance, but I don't know exactly how to use it. But over the years, things began to stabilize things like my credit. I was able to pay for things that I wasn't able to pay for in the past. I had a steady income. And so I had, proof of a steady income so I could get a lease or I could rent an apartment. There still were a number of barriers for me as a formerly incarcerated person. If you don't know, there are over 1,100 permanent punishments and or collateral consequences to incarceration in the state of Illinois. So there's a number of things that I could do when I finally got a full-time job with benefits, but there were still a number of things that I couldn't. And I, after the music, I went back to school, went to Roosevelt University. And it was right around the time that Mike Brown was killed. And it was right after Obama was elected, which I thought for me was like, this is that pivotal moment that we've all been waiting for. And when things did not change, actually what happened is that things became intensified on the ground. We started seeing the visual lynching of our people going viral on Instagram and social media. And so I ended up on the ground in Ferguson, running across the field. I'll never forget. I'm running across this field in the middle of the night. And I mean, it had to be like 12:30, 1 o'clock in the morning. And I looked to my right and one of my professors from Roosevelt University was in the field with me. And that's when I knew that, and she's my and she taught organizing. Her name is NHR. She taught organizing at Roosevelt University. And at that moment, I knew that it was real, that not only were her politics, in the classroom, but she also could carry those politics into direct action. I took her class, and I think if anybody has read social theory, which is, I went to school for sociology, Marx, Dubois, Weber, all of the theorists, it's like at the end of each chapter, nothing changes for Black people until there's either like resurrection, right, or revolution. And so I was consistently in a mode where I was like, I don't see either happening anytime soon. I do see some uprisings, but this is a bit different than revolution. And I don't know when Jesus is coming back or whatever they call it, you know what I mean? Whenever this moment is gonna happen for us. So, what can I do? And I took a class on community organizing, and it was really the first time that I was able to recognize that we can change small things in the form of reforms that won't lead necessarily to liberation, but they will ease the suffering of our people in some way. And so I took a class in community organizing, fell in love with community organizing, got my first job working in the temp labor sector. And I ended up writing my thesis on, the temp labor sector, which is akin to slavery. It is a triangular relationship between, corporate entities that sell human bodies. There's no soft way to say it. You go into these staffing agencies in the morning, 6 o'clock in the morning, you can drive down Roosevelt Avenue, and you'll see a host of staffing agencies. They generally place them on the edge of Black and brown communities, and it aids this competition between the two. And they buy bodies and they sell them to factories. These factories used to be union factories where people were making living wages, $20 an hour. But they outsource the labor and these factories are not in Chicago. They're generally in the surrounding suburbs. And they outsource the labor there. And so one of the things that we noticed when I first got the job is that there was this tension growing between Black and Latinx temp workers. And there was this experience where Black folks were being discriminated against as it related to, getting the job. And they would get there early in the morning, wait in line, and they would say things like, we're doing background checks. And that would completely well, I guess I ain't gonna get a job today. But then they would see Latino workers getting on the buses. And so there was this tension that was happening, and they were like, well, and so we decided we were gonna create a program called Bringing Down Barriers, where we brought in interpreters to have conversations between Black and Latino workers in the staffing agencies. And what they learned is that although Black folks are being discriminated against and not getting access to the jobs themselves were extremely toxic and volatile. And so the language was a barrier. And so the interpreters were able to break down, and they were able to break down that barrier and afforded an opportunity for folks to hear the conversations from the Latinx folks, the Latino folks that were actually getting on the jobs. And they heard stories about exploitation, sexual assault, wage theft, a host of OSHA violations. And the Black folks, I'll never forget, they were sitting in the room and they were like, I wish a mother effer would, right? Like take money out my check and da-da-da-da-da, right? And at that point, we're able to have a conversation about citizenship and the benefits of citizenship, right? And that ultimately, I think my old boss said it the best. They don't like Latino folks more than they like Black folks. They hate each group differently. And that through that, that similarly, we're able to have deeper conversations. And what that ended up creating was a stance of solidarity where Latinx workers refused to go on the sites without Black workers on those buses. Because with Black workers on that bus, at least you will get minimum wage. With Black workers on that bus, they can file OSHA violations. They can file EEOC claims. They can file. They are protected, right? In some way, right? In ways that they were not. And then that work grew into the work that I did with the Workers Center for Racial Justice. And that was kind of like a broader landscape where we weren't just focused on, where I was at before. I was focused solely on the staffing agencies in the temp labor sector. This was more or less the Black diaspora, right? And we were organizing direct actions. And one of the actions that I was able to organize was one of the largest demonstrations against the Fraternal Order of Police in the history of Chicago. And I saw firsthand, the capacity and the and the reaction, right, to our right, against our right to assemble, against our right to demonstrate. And that really just fueled my fire to learn more. And I ended up growing relationships with comrades in the movement for Black Lives, and that broadened my perspective even more. But the unique thing is that within labor and within movement and all the areas that I went, I was consistently missing the people that I grew up with. I was like, well, where are they at? Because they're not here. They weren't getting jobs in the temp labor sector. We're rallying around the murder of people that are similar to the people that I was in the streets with. But when it came to movement and organizing, they weren't present, right? And so I'm like, well, I remember I was sitting at a table with some of my comrades, and I was like, I'm not just gonna be the one to complain about this. I'm gonna build the vehicle to make it happen, right? Like we need to create an on-ramp for the Rekia Boyds and the Mike Browns before they're murdered, right? And they have to be in this movement, right? And so I remember sitting at my desk. At the time, I had another gig. I was working at a place called, I'll keep the name of the place, anonymous for now, but I was doing inclusive procurement work. I've always been a big study, right? You put a problem in front. As a matter of fact, you tell me what I can't do, I'm gonna show you I can do it. That's just the type of person I am. And so I got that, when my homies would say, I got that good job. I was working downtown. I had a suit and tie on. I was working between, the Federation of Labor and the city of Chicago, doing inclusive procurement work. And every time I put that suit and tie on, it felt like a noose, right? There's only a certain amount of code switching and mask wearing that I can do at that point in my career and in my life without feeling like I was suffocating. Although it was a great job, great benefits, all of those brilliant things, I don't think that was my calling, right? And so I think anybody that's thinking about getting into advocacy or activism, one of the things that you should focus on is what is your calling, right? Because there are going to be things that you're good at, and there's going to be things that you're not. And so for me, I decided at that point, I remember I sat down at my desk. We had done this. We won this big contract, which essentially brought railcar development back to the city of Chicago, in the Pullman neighborhood. So if any of you are familiar with A. Philip Randolph and the Pullman Porters, it's a historic movement in the city of Chicago, and you should do your due diligence and look them up. But we brought railcar development back to Pullman, and it was a CTA contract, big deal, and it was $1.3 billion, right? And so they agreed to build a facility in Pullman and hire workers. One of the challenges is that a number of if anybody knows the history of labor, they know that the Wagner Act, or what we call the New Deal, essentially excluded agricultural workers. And at the time, I believe almost 70 to 80% of Black workers were engaged in agricultural work, which is one of the reasons why there's an absence of Black presence within the middle class in the United States of America. And so when you think about unions and unionization, there's been a host of, I think, exclusionary practices as it related to Black bodies being participants in unions. And there are some progressive unions that exist today, but we also have to recognize the history, right? And so when it came to the jobs being dispersed, I mean, I think first and foremost, it goes to card-carrying members, and a number of the card-carrying members weren't necessarily Black. But there were pre-apprenticeship programs that were developed for folks that were Black. The challenge that you will see, and the challenge that I saw in that moment, is that the pre-apprenticeship program lasted almost a year. And by the time people finished the pre-apprenticeship program, the full-time roles within the facility were filled, right? And so what you're dealing with is like the promise of employment, and then there's this idea of this deficit mindset as it relates to the skill sets of Black folks that require additional development, as if we weren't the people who literally built the wealth of this nation. And so there's this, I think that occurrence was hitting me. And I went to my desk and I typed up the numbers, and I looked and I was like, man, there's 80,000 unemployed Black people in the city of Chicago. This is 300 jobs that we produced. And I said to myself, I'm like, well, I'm a firm believer in democracy. And essentially the way I interpret democracy is that if a decision is made that impacts your life, you have a right to play a role in how that decision is made. And so I decided that if those 80,000 Black folks in the city of Chicago were going to seek or find full-time employment, then it was going to be them at the helm of the advocacy work to actually create those jobs. And for me, I had to figure out a framework, right? And I landed on informal workers, because the majority of the folks that were like me grew up without, full-time employment. There's a million reasons why, right? Deindustrialization is a clear example. The war on drugs is a clear example. And for me, I felt like I was around some of the most brilliant people I'd ever met when I was in the streets. The problem was, access to capital. And so some people live paycheck to paycheck. I was around people that live hustle to hustle. And so we would have to come up on different things in order to survive, right? And so for me, I was like, if we consistently just look at, we had to I think for me, it was like we had to broaden our definition of a worker, right? I'm in rallies where we're talking about the workers united will never be defeated. But I'm like, well, for 500 years, right? If you think about slavery, if you think about all the instances where we were not categorized as workers, then how does that definition stand as it relates to us? And so I began to organize. For me, I was like, we have to begin to first understand the scale and scope of informal economies, of Black informal workers. So I went to my computer and I Googled Black informal workers, and nothing popped up. No research, no data set, nothing. And I was like, I'm confused. And so what I learned is that, I think criminalization plays a part. And the reason why there's no research or very little research on Black informality. If you think about Eric Garner, who was killed doing what? You can add it to the chat, right? He was killed selling loose cigarettes. If you think about Alton Sterling, who was killed doing what? Selling DVDs, right? And then if you think about the countless cis and transgender commercial sex workers throughout the world. This is my daughter. Okay, you on camera, baby girl. This is my baby girl. Say hi. Yeah, you can have the baby girl. All right, she be coming up and getting snacks. You know what I mean? When I'm on Zoom, she'd be like, "So can I get these gummy bears?" Anyways, so if you think about, like the Eric Garners, the Alton Sterlings, you think about the countless cis and transgender commercial sex workers that are killed in the United States every year. They are informal workers, right? It's never articulated as such, right? And I want people to also think about Eric Garner, who was killed selling loose cigarettes. You got to understand how hard of a hustle that is, right? That if Eric Garner could have had a full-time job, right? Full-time employment, how that story might have ended differently, right? It's not an easy hustle selling 2 cigarettes for $1. I've done it. It's not an easy hustle, right? And it's and also there's these ideas or these tropes around laziness, et cetera, et cetera. If you up at 6 o'clock in the morning to hustle cigarette, you are not lazy, right? And so the reality is this backstory around collateral consequences, around background checks, it's never surfaced, right? And so we set out to build a political home for Black informal workers, a home for folks who were excluded from the formal economy, for formerly incarcerated and system impacted people, for the Eric Garners, the Alton Sterlings of our world before. And the hope was to politicize them and bring them into democracy and create change. What that has looked like over the course of the past 5 years since we launched in 2018 is that, the first campaign that we had was around recreational cannabis. One of the things that you'll notice if you look at informality is that, informality isn't fixed, or occupations that exist in the informal economy are not fixed. They often migrate from informal to formal. In the informal, you'll have high rates of Black activity. Take a look at number running, bootlegging, right? Alcohol, et cetera, et cetera. So when it came to cannabis, which was a at the time, $1.9 billion industry that was heading for the city of Chicago, once again, we took a look at the current owners. And there were 40 active dispensaries in the state of Illinois in 2019, of which, of the 40 dispensaries that were open, none of them were owned by a Black person, right? And so we're getting ready to see this $1.9 billion industry so sick, we decided to take a look at the bill. What does the recreational cannabis policy say, right? And when we saw it, it was like, oh, this is more of the same, right? What it's gonna produce is inequity, right, at best. And so we began to advocate, and we decided at that moment that any policy that created more barriers to economy for Black informal workers and bridges to economy was an anti-Black policy, and we were going to fight it at all costs. And so we fought for and won one of the first recreational cannabis policies in the state of Illinois to incorporate reparations for the war on drugs. What that means is we fought for and won 800,000 expungements. 25% of the cannabis tax revenue was diverted to community. There's a host of other important pieces. One is that the state of Illinois actually drew out a DIA map, a disproportionately impacted area map that was based on this concept of survivors of the war on drugs. And you could not apply for a license in Illinois unless you came from a disproportionately impacted area. And so those were all just caveats, or I guess policy pieces that were included in HB 1438, which is the Recreational Cannabis Tax Act. And so that was our first fight, right? And out of that, we had this brilliant base of Black informal workers who were engaged in what we call the legacy market, the legacy cannabis market, right? I guess the easiest way to say it. And we would hold these conversations, we call them chronic conversations. The first one that we held was called the Cannabis Equity Convening or Conference or whatever it was. And nobody showed up. At least some people showed up, but they weren't necessarily the people that we were targeting to show up. And there's a way, I think, and what we landed on with that is that there's a way to be inclusive and exclusionary without being explicit about it, right? The language we use to describe the spaces are important, right? We have to begin to use the language, the communal language, if we're trying to target community. And so if we have these think tanks and these spaces that are just like, not necessarily branded in a way that is reflective of the community's language, then they won't show up because they weren't really invited, right? And so we know that, right? And so the end result is that, we switched it to chronic conversations, and, without, the first one, it was standing room only, essentially. Our people were extremely interested in learning more about this, the war on drugs and the impacts that it had on their communities. Most people had loved ones that were currently incarcerated for cannabis, right? For weed, while you have these billionaires walking around on the cover of magazines that are living free. And they're selling way more weed than a nickel bag, right? And they're doing way less than Alton Sterling did or Eric Garner did, right? As it relates to this market. And so we fought for and won that. And then, fast forward, 2020 happened, like most of you all, we were all like kind of pivoting, trying to figure out where we stand. And I think we took the eye off the ball as it related to recreational cannabis, because the people were in dire need, and we began doing direct financial assistance. And what that looked like is that we provided direct financial assistance to 854 households in Austin, Inglewood, and West Garfield Park. The majority of those communities, when you think about ideas, I think it gets into ableism, it gets into anti-Black racism. When you think about ideas like work from home, it is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all type of model. A number of our folks exist off of street economies. And so for them, what does it mean to work from home? And then also, if you think about a number of our folks are survivors of domestic violence. What does it mean to quarantine with your abuser? And so we had to be on the ground the entire pandemic, and that's exactly what we did. Fast forward, I'm going to try to get through all of this. Most recently, one of our interventions is the Chicago Future Fund, which is a guaranteed income pilot program for formerly incarcerated people. One of the themes that came up is that we want to build the alternatives, right? Like, because it was one thing to go in our community and talk about guaranteed income and tell them what it was. It's another thing for them to experience it. And so for us, we began to build out, we thought it was best to build out the alternatives so that folks could feel it. And so we currently have the Chicago Future Fund running, and it like flipped the narrative on its head. Like, you had to be formally incarcerated to be eligible, which was hard for folks to believe in, at the time. But if we didn't have the name, the reputation that we had in the community, we don't think that people would have signed up, because it was an opportunity for folks. When generally your record serves as a barrier, it served as like your entry point. And so ultimately, we're trying to figure out ways to design the alternatives and that we imagine, and that our community imagines, and that it's focused on the least of us. I think we have intervention after intervention in this city that focuses on the cream of the crop. You get front page news if you get a 4.0 GPA. You know what I mean? And you get accepted into college, whatever that is, like that's important. But you can't get to equity in the city of Chicago if you ignore the margins. And so for me, it was like super important to bring the margins deeper into our democracy to create, social change. That our organization, what we do, essentially, we build comprehensive campaigns rooted in research. One of the first pieces of research we released was the Survival Economies Report, which looks at the scale and scope of Black informality on Chicago's West Side. We also have we do base building. So we have chapters, one chapter in Chicago, another one in Joliet, and we plan to build chapters throughout the state of Illinois before it's all over with. What we do in those chapters is political education, personal development. To be a member of Equity and Transformation, we have two different routes. You can become a general member. That means that you're an informal worker. And the other is that you're an ally, and that's somebody that understands and sees the problem. And the problem is that, I think in Chicago and in some of these larger liberal cities, racism isn't written on the door. It's written in the policies. It's written in the eligibility criteria. It's written in the credentialism. And so we keep complaining like, oh, we're not at equity, but we know why, right? We know why we haven't achieved equity. It's not hidden. The reality, the reason we haven't achieved equity is because we have people that truly understand and have read the new Jim Crow and understand the problem related to mass incarceration, who still come out here and perform background checks on people because they don't see the connection between mass incarceration and unemployment, right? Like that, it's mind-boggling at times when I hear people say like, yeah, we want to see equity, but not for those people. And the reality that those people are impacted by mass incarceration, which is what most people understand as the new Jim Crow, and yet and still they haven't relinquished this concept of background checks and collateral consequences for formerly incarcerated people. And so we believe that incarceration is a driver as it relates to informality, right? And what that looks like is and for the Chicago Future Fund participants who are all system impacted, formerly incarcerated people, our program is also a study, and it looks at income volatility, psychological wellness, physical functioning and recidivism. So they fill out a small survey monthly before the payment is released, right? And so one of the things we track is like employment. And for the first round, which was 30 participants, we had almost 80% of them were applying for up to 7 jobs a month. This was an 18-month program. We got some preliminary results, and we also got a list of the places that they were actually, we know where folks were applying to. And so at 12 months, you had folks that have been applying for 7 jobs a month for 12 months, and at 12 months, they still hadn't found employment, right? And so for me, this is, there's one way, it makes you feel bad, right? Because that's the reality that folks are faced with. And this is at a time where the economy is booming, where, they're saying that we can't find, we have a job surplus in Chicago. And the question we have to begin to ask ourselves as Chicagoans or whatever is jobs for who? And when you look at the eligibility and you pair that to the outcomes of the particular communities that are in need of employment, what you'll see is that the credentials are not matching the need, right? And so if you're looking for, you know what I mean? Like if you gotta have a doctorate's degree or a master's degree or a bachelor's degree, and you recognize that the system failures in Chicago have produced, communities where the majority of folks there don't even have high school diplomas, then what are you saying as it relates to this surplus for employment? Is that these are jobs not for you, right? And so this data set really is combating a lot of the narratives that I think the negative tropes related to our community, like folks are lazy and don't want to work. The reality is that our people are not running from labor. Labor is literally running from them. And so we are wrestling with those ideas and I think ultimately like lifting up the contradictions embedded in this system of what we know is capitalism. And so we are, we're a bold organization. We're a new organization. We were founded in 2018. We currently have about 11 employees, full and part-time. We operate in Austin, Inglewood, West Garfield Park, and Joliet right now, currently. We build alternatives. We grow the base, and we empower the members through political education, and we're creating change, right? I think that's the most important, whether it be the transformative change that happens in the individual when we're doing political education, or it's the policies that we're advancing to change some of the material conditions in our communities. We feel like we're doing that work. And so we invite anybody that's on the call, to be part of that, I think this legacy of work. And I'll say very clearly that our work is in direct correlation to, the baton that was passed to us from the Black Panther parties and the SNCC organizations, and before them, this is a history of work. And for equity and transformation, what we're trying to do is just focus heavily on the people that are in the most need, and humanize a population, which is, Black informal workers. A lot of these folks have records. They say that there should be no barrier to economy. And particularly if we live and exist in a country where I think like the silent agreement is that the business class will produce these jobs, right? And that our agreement is that we will work those jobs for a wage, and that wage will be a living wage. And that's essentially what this framework of capitalism essentially prescribes to. But in reality, there's a deficit as it relates to employment opportunities for our folks. And it's been like that for years. And it is due to systemic racism. It is due to, I'll just keep it right there. It is due to systemic racism. And so, yeah, I'm happy to be here. We're down to open it up for questions. And yeah, I'm sorry I don't have like a presentation. I don't do that too often. I kind of just speak from the heart, and hopefully some things land.
Thank you so much. That was so enriching, so amazing. And so if anyone, yes, clap, clap. If anyone would like to come off mic, we can have a couple people come off mic and ask some questions of our speaker.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk a little more about some of the current initiatives your organization is doing. Like I was stalking your website a little bit and reading about the Breathe initiative. If you could talk more about that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So equity and transformation, we currently have, so we've done a legacy of work. We've done different things. In the pandemic, we were part of the as a member of the Movement for Black Lives, if you know, there was a piece of legislation we're trying to move on a federal level called the Breathe Act. Then there was some curiosity about what can we move on the ground in local states. And so we worked together with a coalition of organizations to pull together an omnibus bill called the Breathe Act. And that Breathe Act was incorporated into HB 3653, which is an omnibus bill that the Black Caucus introduced and was signed into law. And that bill included ending money bond, pretrial fairness, which is the Pretrial Fairness Act, and the prison gerrymandering component. So that's some of the work that we did around Breathe, and we did a number of actions and activities around the death of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd in the city of Chicago, to kind of raise awareness around what we want to see changed as it related to policing in Chicago. I think where we are now is that, we came and we looked at HB 1438. We saw the deficits as it related to the interpretation. We had a number of legislators that said we're there at the bill signing, where they said this is about reparations for the war on drugs, and it is far from that. The reality is that reparations, and we use the UN's definition of reparations. It requires that you have a guarantee of non-repetition, you have compensation, you have rehabilitation, restitution, and satisfaction. And those are not fully, it was in the original interpretation of the bill, but in the implementation, they failed in a number of those areas. So we have stood up the Illinois Reparations Coalition to demand for to win true drug war reparations in our lifetime. And so what that looks like now, it's called the Big Payback, it's the name of the campaign. And what that looks like on the ground is, or what that looks like in reality is that we are fighting for cannabis tax revenue to be used to create a permanent fund for survivors of the war on drugs, and that they get direct cash payments. Right now, the cannabis tax revenue that we were able to get moved, which was 25%, it's for one, I don't have the right numbers, so I don't want to misquote, but millions from the first year, millions and millions from the second year, millions and millions from the third year, right? And this is with the cannabis economy at about 1/3 of scale. So once it gets to scale, which means that there'll be dispensaries and cultivators all throughout the state of Illinois, the tax revenue pool will just grow. What we're saying to the state of Illinois is that, yes, nonprofit organizations are important. We're happy that you're funding them, but nonprofit organizations are not the survivors of the war on drugs. The people are. And you need to put this direct cash payments, these payments, compensation into the pockets of the people. And so we have the drug war reparations campaign currently, and that's our main campaign. And I can share information on how folks can get involved with that.
Great, thank you so much.
Yes, and I also did put information about each campaigns, initiatives, how to get involved and things like that. So let me see. So Tanya, if you'd like to go next, I saw your hand up.
Thank you so much. Mr. Wallace, thank you so much. That was inspiring and incredible. I'm calling in from Havana, Cuba, so the Wi-Fi is not great, so my apologies ahead of time. I'm a trauma surgeon at the University of Chicago, on the south side. And we've been fortunate enough to start a medical legal partnership for our trauma patients affected by firearm violence. And what this means is we have 2 lawyers from Legal Aid Chicago, civil rights lawyers and public benefits attorneys that go to the bedside and talk to people affected by gun violence to try to do things like expunge criminal records, protect them against job loss, against eviction, and get crime victim compensation, which would allow them up to $45,000 in funds. And we're trying to figure out ways of using these mechanisms for structural reparations, as we've been talking about. In your opinion, how might we be able to leverage what the lawyers are able to do to best support our trauma patients? That's maybe a hard question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Yeah, well, enjoy Cuba while you're there. Yeah, I was recently, as reminding me, I spent some time in Cuba, and yeah, the medical field there is just phenomenal. So shout out to all the doctors because I've never been in a room full of more doctors in my entire life. Like, everybody had a PhD. So yeah, that's that. As it relates to gun violence and I think standing up a real reparations campaign in the city of Chicago, our pathway to reparations will be through learning the law, right? We have to learn what's preventing or restricting, there's a number of things that are preventing it from occurring. But what ways can we legally kind of, challenge or build the challenge for this case around reparations? I think one of the things that's most unique to me, I don't know if I can answer the question wholly, but one of the things that's so unique to me is that people see our people hurting every day. And they can't make the connection and they say that, well, slavery was in the past. The war on drugs was in the past. Redlining was in the past. We shouldn't pay for past mistakes now, right? Everybody's got an equal shot, right? Without actualizing the reality of the harm that was caused through these policies exist in the bodies of our people today, right? And in the mobility of our people today. And so I think, building the case, whether it be around trauma, and, that was one of the most heartbreaking statistics I had to read, is just as it relates to rates of intra-community violence. That is, it's a challenging field to work in, to actually see, the results of this. But it should be also be a driver to create better, experiences for our people, right, in the city of Chicago. And so I feel you. I don't know if I can answer your question specifically, as I'm not an attorney, but we need them, right? I think as it relates to drafting policy, to really being able to interpret the law, like, we need folks that can draft policies that are and track them through their implementation.
That was amazing. Thank you. So we actually have some questions in the discussion board that we would like to get to. So, and though in the questions that were posted on the discussion board will also be put in the chat box for those to read. So in connection to the discussion in class last week, where we looked at relying on policy as the primary response to mental health needs in crisis, what would mental health programs that do not involve police response ultimately also would those ultimately also improve access for Black Chicagoans? If so, how? And if so, what data is available regarding employment access that could be used to support policies that aim to reduce and reform policing in Chicago? Wow. Yes. Interesting. And for you to read, it will be put in the chat in a moment so that you can read it because it was it was a deep question.
Yeah, can you please put that in the chat so I can read it one more time? I think.
Yeah, we're doing it now. Yeah, we're getting it in now. Don't worry. Okay. Oh, there it is.
All right, there we go.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent to the discussion. Hmm. I don't, I think to the first question, the way that we get to the employment question is through targeted employment opportunities. That means like literally we advocate for the creation, right, of jobs that are void of credentialism and speak specifically to the populations in need of employment, right? I think when we, so that's how we get there. And there's John Powell out of the Othering and Belonging Institute in California recently wrote on this idea of targeted universalism. And I think that's a framework that folks should look up, because in that, I think a lot of times we think about universal basic income, that means everybody gets a check, but some people don't need it, right? Like what our program is a targeted guaranteed income pilot program. We're focusing on the people that are in need. I think another thing that rings true for me is that like Black people are not a monolith, right? It is not a one size fits all. There are some of us that are thriving and some of us that are not, right? And so for us, it's like super important that we focus on the need, the people that are in need the most, and then create the jobs for them, right? And make sure that we advocate heavily for those people. And so what data is available regarding employment access that could be used to support police policies that aim to reduce and reform policing in Chicago? So there's this campaign that's called the Fully Free campaign, which focuses on erasing the collateral consequences to incarceration. Essentially, what's going on is that people leave a 4x4 cell to come home to a cell of over 1,000 doors being shut, right? It's a new cell. It's a new form of incarceration. It's one thing to be incarcerated behind bars in a state facility. It's another thing to be incarcerated in what we call the world. When we come home from jail, we're like, I'm going to the world, right? And then you come home and you're faced with, one, you have a host of fines that you have to pay back to the state. Some people come home on a house monitoring, which is a new cost. And at the same time, that same state that's demanding that they pay for A, B, and C supports the system of background checks that prevents them from finding or getting full-time employment. And so we need to, I think there's another article that I think that folks should look up, and it's called The Dignity of Labor. It's a concept around the dignity of labor. And essentially what they're talking about with the dignity of labor is that being able to labor and produce a wage that and that you can use to acquire subsistence, right? Being food, water, and shelter is actually a humanizing experience. Most people want to provide for themselves, right? The challenge is that we're in a system that refuses to allow us to actually participate fully in the economy. And that's been an experience we've had for 500 years. And it's looked different over time. And one point in time, it was, chattel slavery, right? The 3/5 clause, right? And so we were not considered full citizens, and therefore we could not get a full wage. Then there were Jim Crow laws. Then there's mass incarceration, right? There's black codes and mass incarceration. And mass incarceration is the newest iteration of this extraction of Black labor value in under U.S. capitalism, right? And so for us, we have to begin to focus on just like seeing that arc, seeing that history, and being able to call it out for what it is. They arrest our youth at astronomical rates, essentially because for one, they couldn't find jobs, and so they reverted to street economies in order to survive. And then while they're in the street economies, they caught cases, and that then defends them on the back end when they come home from finding full-time employment. And we have to wake up to the fact that that's just not the way that we want this society to be. And so maybe that answers part of your questions, but I do not think there's essentially a data set that's looking at that, but I think it's something that maybe folks should develop.
Wow, thank you so much. So our action lab, which is for the second half of class for students who are here, is quite long. So we would love to take this time to thank you for all of the work that you've done and are doing and all the education. And also, if you would like to reach out to Mr. Wallace, like I said, I posted information about the organization in the chat, but he has also said that he's open to getting more information from people as well. So thank you so much. I'm going to stop the recording now.